Zoom lecture. My title tonight is Heavenly Work on Earth, Medieval Bridge Building as an Act of Piety. Now, today, national government agencies or local authorities are generally responsible for the construction of maintenance of roads and bridges. But in the Middle Ages, the situation was quite different. Instead, landowners, both secular and ecclesiastical, and local communities undertook these duties. Bridge construction and maintenance were seen as pious charitable deeds because these actions were helping the community and preventing deaths or serious accidents which often occurred when people waded across fords. Prior to the Reformation, crosses and chapels were common sights at bridges, enabling travellers to offer prayers and monetary thanks when setting out or on completion of a journey. Now, some people chose to give their money to their local church, but bridge building and road building or their repair were much better bets because they were still pious and charitable, so you got plenty of kudos, but they also benefited your community in a practical way that installing some stained glass windows in your parish church never would. I want to briefly explain when and why this practice came about in England and then how it ended. You can see medieval London Bridge, and in the centre of it there's a very prominent chapel devoted to St Thomas the Martyr or St Thomas of Canterbury. Right, sacred rivers. You're looking at the Iron Age Battersea Shield. It was made sometime between 350 and 50 BC, and it was recovered from the Thames during dredging in 1857. It's here to remind us that from the middle of the second millennium BC, across Europe, people started to worship or venerate lakes, rivers, and springs. This practice is evidenced by the amount of valuable metalwork that was deliberately deposited in watery places, including the Thames. Right, Roman shrines. To the right, you've got the head of a colossal bronze statue. It stands 41 centimeters high. It's of the Emperor Hadrian. He was born at AD 76 and reigned from 117 to 138. This is him apparently aged about 30, some 15 years before his visit to Britannia in AD 122. It was recovered during dredging of the Thames in 1834, close to the third arch of London Bridge, and it may represent an ex situ portion of a statue that originally stood on the bridge and presumably at some point been broken up and put in the river. A bit like happened to Edward Colson in Bristol last year. It's a classic way of getting rid of public statues you don't want anymore, isn't it? And on the left, you can see a reconstruction of the late Roman phase of the bridge. It's looking northwards, hence the big gatehouse in the mid-3rd century river wall. It's probable that the Roman bridges across the Tyne at Newcastle, where there's been a lot of material recovered, including ex situ altars, and the Thames here in London, both possess shrines. Dredging of the Thames around London Bridge has produced a vast amount of objects, including many coins, the bronze head you've just heard about. So all this evidence looks as though a lot of votive material was simply put into the river. Here's a rather lovely Roman bridge, the Bridge of Trajan in Alacantia. The six-arch masonry bridge spanning the Tagus in Spain is 194 meters long. And if you look in the center, there's a triumphal arch. It's got an inscription on. And this tells us it was built between AD 104 and 106. And at the end of it, if you look to the right, you can see a little building. This was originally a temple commemorating the bridge engineer, but it was later converted into a chapel dedicated to St. Julian. The bridge has actually been rebuilt various times as the arches have been blown up and destroyed various times in wars, latterly during the Napoleonic War. So that explains why the bridge looks so neat. But I think the lower part of it, the actual piers rather than the arches, are probably largely Roman. So you can see how the link comes in with commemorating builders, architects, shrines, triumphal arches. There's a pattern emerging here. And here we can see further evidence of this practice. You're looking at, on the left, a mosaic portrait of the Emperor Justinian, also known as the Great. He was Byzantine emperor between AD 527 and 565. This is his portrait. It's contemporary in a church in Ravenna in northern Italy. And on the left, you've got an open-air shrine that was built at the end of the Sangarius Bridge in Western Turkey. This was one of a number of bridges that was built by Justinian, and it looks to me like some sort of open-air shrine or chapel. It's got a very clear apsidal end that's good evidence of a chapel. In about AD 560, there was a historian known as Procoptus of Caesarea. He wrote this dreadfully sycophantic account of the numerous construction projects undertaken by the Emperor Justinian. These included building various churches that showed his piety and bridges. And in one instance, at the end of a bridge, he constructed a church supposedly for travelers to take refuge in during storms. This was at Galicia in Turkey. And this chapel was at a place called Skylacon on the River Cerberus, but its location isn't known anymore, which is a shame, because it's potentially one of the earliest bridge chapels we've got. Right. Okay, you might have asked yourself, this guy's rambling on about bridge chapels, and he hasn't actually explained what they are. Well, on the left, you can see a quick definition. And on the right, it's probably more fun, you can see the remains of St. Andrew's Chapel. This is on the end of the Elvet Bridge in Durham. The chapel was founded in between 1212 and 1230. This bridge was started before 1195 and was completed some point in the 1220s. So the chapel was an original part of it. If you notice, the buildings are above an arch that's nicely round, and on the left you can see a very Gothic looking arch that's spanning the river. The difference is you've got an original arch on the right and a rebuilt, probably 15th century arch on the left. This is one of the things that bedevils the study of bridges. They're very extensively rebuilt. People are always saying this bridge is 12th century, and you think, well, probably some of it is, but rather like cathedrals, not all of it is. So now we've established that what a bridge chapel is. The important thing to mention is that, yes, it's a place of worship, and it can be at either end of the bridge or on it. But I would stress it's very important that you can try and get a documented relationship between the bridge and the chapel, because quite a lot of sites you get a chapel at the end of the bridge and no documentation. Most of the best known surviving examples that you'll be seeing in a few minutes: St Benezet's Bridge at Avignon, St Ives, Cambridge, Wakefield, West Yorkshire, all possess chapels that are situated on an enlarged bridge pier. So there's a very clear link. And it's important to remember that these well-known examples have affected the popular perception of what a bridge chapel is. Research has established that actually the majority of bridge chapels in England were actually located at one end, or sometimes a short distance away from the bridge. So in other words, they weren't necessarily physically part of the bridge. Poor documentation of bridge chapels is a huge problem. So a lot of details like their precise location or dedication can't be established. As I'll explain later, a vast number of bridge chapels have disappeared, so they're only known from some limited documentation. Now, it gets more complicated because sometimes hospitals in bridgehead locations served as bridge chapels and maintained their adjoining bridges. I'll give you one example: St John's Hospital, Lechlade in Gloucestershire. This was established in about 1246, and in 1318 the hospital received the first of a series of pontage grants for bridge repair. Now, these were effectively crown grants that allowed you to collect tolls or taxes from people who used the bridge for a fixed period of time. And the hospital was probably given this job for administrative convenience, because they'd have been looked upon as a responsible public body that was actually going to collect the money, not run off with it, and then spend the money doing the job of repairing the bridge. But it becomes even more complicated because some urban hospitals served as bridge chapels. One example will suffice: the Hospital of St John the Baptist in Nottingham. This is in the historic town centre, some distance from Nottingham Bridge. But from 1202 onwards, the hospital was entrusted with the repair of Trent Bridge and collected alms for that purpose. So in other words, the hospital's chapel that's nowhere near the bridge functioned as a bridge chapel. Okay, so this spatial link doesn't always work. Right, spatial locations. I've already mentioned that you can see on the left the options. I sound a bit like an estate agent. Looking for a bridge chapel, sir or madam? I can offer you various possibilities. You can be on the actual bridge, where you get this enlarged pier, which you've just seen, or sometimes the building is founded on an arch sprung between two piers, or sometimes one pier and an abutment. So in other words, the building is parallel with the axis of the bridge. You can be at the end of the bridge. Crumford's a good surviving, though ruinous, example. And on the bridge approach, you can see I've listed two, and on the right you can see Rochester, one of those examples. While you're looking at Rochester, this bridge chapel was completed in 1393, and it's on the southern approach to the medieval bridge, which is why it's still here today. It was restored in 1930. It was the 1930s, and is now part of the Rochester Bridge Trust premises. They still care for the bridge that spans the Medway in Rochester, rather like the Bridge Trust still cares for London Bridge. They're a very rare survival of a bridge group, and when they were set up, this was one of the things they did. They built this lovely chapel. And before we leave this slide, I'd like to draw your attention that some bridges didn't just have one chapel. A couple had two or more. Elvet Bridge in Durham has chapels dedicated to St Andrew and St James. Exeter Bridge is top of the pops. It has St Edmund's Chapel that becomes a parish church, and at the opposite end it's got St Thomas of Canterbury's Chapel, and then by 1257 they acquire a Chantry Chapel that was opposite St Edmund's. So it was a bit like shops. You've got tremendous variety of places of worship and of course to give your money to. Here's a rather lovely example of a bridge chapel. You can see on the right, this is St Ives Town Bridge, and this is built on a hugely enlarged pier. You can see a close-up of the chapel on the right and a general view on the left. You can see that the chapel is a two-storey structure. This is quite common with the larger chapels. So you've got an upper story which is at the same level as the walkway of the bridge, and this is the actual chapel. Then you get a lower floor or undercroft underneath, and you can see the door that leads out onto the balcony which serves the lower floor. This chapel was consecrated in 1426 when the bridge was rebuilt. It's a great story. It closed during the Reformation. It was then used as a house. In 1736, two additional brick-built stories were added to the top of it. And by the 1850s, it was being used as a public house known as Little Hell. I quote, "It was notoriously bad. Pigs were kept in the lower story. During a drunken brawl on a fair day, a man was thrown over the balcony into the river and almost drowned. The lower story balcony was the site of the toilet that was a little wooden sentry box. So presumably on a wet night, if you had a few drinks, you could fall in the river if you weren't careful." By 1871, the pub had closed. It was then used as a doctor's surgery, and from about 1885, it was a house. In 1927, the chapel house was purchased by St Ives Town Council. It was restored in 1930. The two brick-built stories were demolished, in case you're thinking, where are they? And today the chapel is open to the public and used by the local Catholic community for services. Right, moving on. On the left, you've got Maidenhead in Berkshire. This is a reconstruction of the chapel of St Andrew and St Mary Magdalene. This was actually located in the roadway that you can see in the foreground that leads to the bridge, which you can see disappearing off to the right. It was in existence by about 1270, but was demolished in 1825 to improve the traffic flow. This chapel was cared for by a hermit, and it also had a resident chaplain. I should say hermits often acted as bridge wardens or caretakers that have collected tolls, kept the chapel clean, swept the floor. And hermits, in case you're wondering, were really male recluses. These were pious laymen with a religious vocation who didn't join any sort of established monastic order, but wanted to do something socially useful. And if you became a bridge chapel hermit, this also gave you somewhere to live, that I suppose was an obvious advantage, and it also gave you a source of income. So it sort of ticked all the boxes that you withdrew from society, but still had a socially useful role. Now, most bridge chapels were small single cell structures. You can see Maidenhead was a bit bigger. And very few contained burials, but some like Maidenhead functioned as chapels of ease or parochial chapels. These were chapels that served communities that weren't near a parish church, so it was basically easy for them to go to the chapel. Maidenhead eventually acquired a parish church, so that's one of the reasons they could demolish this one. On the right, you've got an amazing bridge chapel, probably one of the most famous ones at Avignon. And this is to remind us that this is an international phenomenon. Bridge chapels existed in Wales, Scotland and Ireland, France, Germany, Greece, Italy, Portugal, Russia, Spain, Switzerland and Turkey. So it's an international concept. All sorts of communities are buying into it. And it seems to start in the medieval period in Western Europe with the French. During 1030 to 1037, Etude II, Count of Blois, announced he would construct a bridge across the Loire at Tours for the benefit of his soul. So you can see he isn't doing it just for his own convenience. He's doing it for a spiritual purpose. But as I explained earlier, everyone would have thought well of him for it. This is a very interesting bridge at Avignon because Saint Benazet, who died in about 1184, is credited during the 1170s with organising the construction of this bridge across the Rhone, for which he was canonised. He's the only person who built a bridge who was canonised, and he was buried in this rather lovely two-storey bridge. You can see it's the same pattern as St Ives, with one story at the same level as the walkway of the bridge, and then a lower story which is also a chapel here. You can see the other interesting thing I'd like to draw your attention to is quite a lot of medieval bridges didn't have handrails or parapets. The French Antiquities Service have put up the iron handrails to stop the visitors like me falling into the river. But in the medieval period, there was just that low curb, which is literally ankle height. So if you were careless, or there's one account on a windy day, some guys are blown off the bridge and end up in the river and are rescued by fishermen. Right, moving on. Okay, on the left we've got Ouse Bridge in York. Well, I'm showing you this lovely engraving of the bridge because it's a very early example of a bridge chapel. You can see on the right hand side of the bridge you've got a chapel with a little turret that's got a clock tower, and next to it there's a council chamber. Now notice how these buildings are founded. They're actually sprung on additional arches that are separate to the bridge but are sharing the same set of foundations. So in other words, you've got narrow rectangular buildings that are parallel with the axis of the bridge. This chapel and the bridge was demolished in 1810 when a new wider bridge was constructed. Medieval bridges were always single lane. So in the post-medieval period, with industrialization, increased volumes of road traffic, a lot have been replaced by wider bridges, simply so the traffic can move quicker and to make space for pedestrians. There were a lot of accidents when you just had one lane of traffic, people going in two directions and pedestrians weaving in and out. On the right, you've got a lovely reconstruction by Jane Reed that was done for the recent publication of the archaeology of the ex-bridge, and it's the east end of the bridge. On the left side of the bridge you can see St Edmund's Chapel, and again, like the one on Ives Bridge, it's sprung from the pier foundations, so as a line parallel to the main axis of the bridge. And you can see on the left side of the bridge roadway a Chantry chapel that was added later in the 13th century. This was dedicated to St Mary the Virgin. She's a very popular saint, and the majority of medieval bridge chapels where we've got a dedication are dedicated to her. So are the majority of parish churches, ancient and modern. She's just top of the pops when it comes to dedications. Nobody else can touch her. It's a pity she can't claim royalties. Right, moving on. As we're in London, you can see on the left, got a nice reconstruction of the London Bridge chapel. London Bridge, as I mentioned earlier, it was completed in 1209, and as an integral part of the bridge, you had this two-story chapel. Again, you can see it one story on the same level as the roadway, and a lower story. This was also a formal chapel. You can see some of its windows. So you've got the option of actually arriving to the lower story by boat, as well as descending by staircase. Now, this is dedicated to St Thomas of Canterbury. If you remember, he was the guy who was murdered in Canterbury Cathedral. He dies in 1170, and he's canonized in 1173, which is remarkably quick. Obviously the church did it to annoy the king. And the chapel you're looking at is a rebuild in the Perpendicular style. This was rebuilt between 1384 and 1396 under the architectural direction of Henry Yelling. He died in 1400, and he was bridge warden from 1365 to 1399. And we know that before the Reformation, the chapel contained a board outlining its history, and this explained that it had been rebuilt by a mason in charge of the bridge. And so you can see that there's a nice link there. And also it's interesting that two other chapels that we know of, Rochester and Newcastle on Tyne, also have boards which have lists of sponsors, rather like modern sports clubs. When you go there, have a list of you know, who's sponsored them. Bridge chapels did just the same. So your good deeds then, as they are now, are made public through your sponsorship. This chapel closed during the Reformation in about 1548, and was then converted into a grocer's shop. Its superstructure was demolished in 1557 to 62 when the bridge roadway was widened, and the lower floor of the chapel was rediscovered when the bridge was demolished in the 1830s. On the right, you've got the remains of St Mary's Bridge Chapel, Crumford in Derbyshire. This is a three-arch bridge spanning the Derwent, and you can see at the southeast end of the bridge are the remains of a chapel. You just see some of the upstanding walls. Its existence is documented in 1504, and we know it closed in about 1547. It was then used as cottages, but sadly the upper story was demolished by Richard Arkwright in 1796, and this photograph was taken some years ago. The site is now derelict, and I think it's in danger of collapse, which is rather sad. But these things happen. Moving on to St Mary's Bridge in Derby. On the left, you can see the chapel as it is today. It's a good news story, it's still with us. It was probably built by the burgesses of Derby in the late 13th century. The bridge is first documented in 1287. We know there's a chapel here by 1360, and next door there was a house for the priest. In 1468, there was a resident hermit here collecting alms and tolls. He and his wife were assaulted. I assume some people refused to pay the tolls, and the people who assault them are arrested and charged. The chapel closed, as they all pretty much did, in about 1547. But interestingly, Derby hung on to this one and used it as a workshop for the poor and the unemployed, the sort of make work premises. And then it was used as housing and latterly a workshop. It was derelict by the 1920s, but beautifully restored in 1930 to 31 as an Anglican place of worship. And you can see the interior of it today on the right. It's obviously been extensively rebuilt. You can see over time. There's a lot of the brickwork is later, but nevertheless, it still gives you a good idea of the appearance of it. Moving on, right, Wakefield, West Yorkshire. This is one of our most famous chapels, and it was here that bridge chapels were rediscovered. And the guy who actually rediscovers it is a certain Norison Scratchard. What a great name. If I was going to change my name, that's the one I'd pick. In 1828, he publishes this rambling treatise on ancient bridge chapels, which is actually available online if you want to look it up afterwards. And it was largely devoted to Wakefield Bridge Chapel in an attempt to promote its restoration. This is a chapel, as I'll show you, which is built on the side of an enlarged pier, as you can see to the right. And the license for its construction was granted in 1398. It was closed in 1547 and then used as a series of commercial premises. And sort of history was made here. And because in the 1840s, you can see on the left, two architects, the Buckler brothers, visited it, recorded it, and wrote about it to try and promote its restoration. And they produced these lovely illustrations of it that was great, because though it was fortunate, it was restored in 1847 under the architectural direction of Sir George Gilbert Scott. Sadly, his aim wasn't to restore the medieval fabric of the beautiful building. You can see on the left, it had an amazing front with a facade depicting scenes from the life of Christ, we think. But he instead demolished what was left and built a replica of the medieval building as he thought it had originally appeared. And in 1848, this rebuilding reopens as an Anglican place of worship. Here are two illustrations that were produced by the Bucklers, which show the ground story of the chapel before Gilbert Scott gets his hands on it, and its lower floor as well. So you can see how it had this lower floor, but only occupying half the footprint under the east end. And you can see this was accessed by a spiral staircase, which you can see in the top right-hand corner of the ground floor. One interesting thing, if you look to the left, the west front, which has got these three doors, that little recess in it that looks like a wash basin was where a font had been. This is quite unusual. Not many bridge chapels seem to have had a font. Right. Morpeth, Northumberland, a rather lovely bridge chapel. On the left, you can see the west front of the medieval chapel, and you can see how it fronts onto the bridge approach road. And on the right, you can see a map of Morpeth produced in 1826. And you can, if you look closely at the big black blob in the centre, number 6 is the medieval chapel, and number 7 shows the early 18th century extension and rebuilding of the chapel that included the town's grammar school. You can see nearby the medieval bridge. This has now been replaced by a new bridge to the right, but notice how there's a slight gap between the chapel and the bridge. The two actually aren't touching or joining. This chapel has an amazing history. It's first documented in 1294, the same date as the bridge. So we imagine they were built as a package. It served as a chapel of ease for the town, as they'd got no parish church nearby. And in 1522, they have a grammar school established and based here in the chapel. And over time, the town expands, the school expands, hence the 18th century rebuilding. And in 1842, they get their own parish church, the church moves out. Then in 1858, the school relocates, and the former chapel becomes a commercial premises, and now it's a museum of Northumberland bagpipes, a craft shop, and a tourist information centre. It's a fantastic building, and it's great. It's been preserved and has acquired a new function. Now, not all medieval bridges possessed chapels. Some of them had crosses and shrines as an alternative. Of course, some bridges possessed both. Crosses on bridges are a nightmare to study because they're incredibly badly documented, so almost certainly they are underrepresented in the record. I'm going to show you 3 examples. On the left, you've got Maisie Moor Bridge in Gloucestershire, and at one end of the bridge there's this cross and inscription. This is actually a 1956 replica of a vanished 13th century example. And in the centre, you've got a cross from Pershaw Bridge, which obviously isn't there anymore. It's in the fire escape, the local heritage centre. And the present bridge you can see is largely 15th century, but this cross was found in 1955 when there was dredging beneath the central arch of the bridge. On stylistic grounds, it's 13th or 14th century date. It's about 80 centimetres high. Its existence on the bridge isn't documented, but presumably it's sat on the parapet. I think it's been reconstructed incorrectly, and the cross should actually be parallel with the long axis of the coping stone. But how did it end up in the river? Well, I can see 2 possibilities. Somebody pushed it in during the Reformation when these sort of things went out of fashion, or 1644 during the English Civil War, the retreating Royal Army blow up the 2 central arches of the bridge to hinder Cromwell's progress. So, you know, either is a possibility. And on the right, you've got the 1296 common seal of the Burgh of Stirling in Scotland. This depicts a timber bridge with 8 piers or trestles spanning the River Forth. Notice the oversized crucifix in the centre. The Latin round the edge translates as, "Here stands the Highland Scots in arms. Here they stand in safety in the cross." It's interesting to note that this bridge collapsed in 1297 when the English army was crossing it, and as a result they were utterly defeated by the Scots led by William Wallace. This battle ended English attempts to take over their country for a while. So you can see that there was obviously some sort of cross on the medieval bridge, and this is the only evidence we've actually got for it. So as I said to you before, these things are so badly documented. People have been looking at this cross for years and there's seal and writing about it, but very few of them have thought, bit strange really, this bridge having a huge cross in the centre. But people didn't just put crosses on bridges, they sometimes put plaques, and you can see on the left a transcription of a plaque that was on a bridge at Stanford-on-Team in Worcestershire. And you can see Humphrey Packerton had paid for the construction of this bridge in 1247 to 48. And he wanted people to pray for him. Now, asking people to pray for your soul before the Reformation was pretty common. There's a number of inscriptions that do this, but this late date is unusual, and that's almost certainly why the word soul has been omitted from the text, because the Reformation's already coming in and doctrines changed. We think most crosses and plaques were removed from bridges during the English Reformation. Humphrey's Bridge is long gone, but on the right you can see the Ferro concrete footbridge that was put up in 1905. Right, St Martin's Bridge in Norwich. There's an amazing map produced in 1541 called the Sanctuary Map of Norwich. You can see a detail, whoops, getting too carried away here, a detail on the left that shows St Martin's Bridge. Notice this prominent cross on the centre of it. Thanks to Brian Ayres for drawing my attention to it in 2019. This is the only evidence that we're aware of for a cross on this bridge. This bridge was rebuilt in 1591 and is today known as Whitefriars Bridge. So there's obviously no cross there, but it just shows how rare these things are in terms of the documentation, and the fact it's not made it into the literature until I asked Brian if he knew of any examples, and 5 minutes later he produced a book in the Society of Antiquaries Library with this in. Amazing. Anyway, bit of a change here. Right. I want to say a bit about chantry chapels and personal salvation, because in the medieval period people were obsessed with the concept of salvation. Your aim was to avoid the sort of situation you can see here. This is Mad Meg as seen by Bruegel the Elder in circa 1562. He was a Flemish painter and he liked these sort of bizarre scenes. I rather like this giant woman who's running away from all the commotion on the right, which is sort of the mouth of hell, scenes of conflict and pillage. There's all sorts of bizarre monsters. I think you could retitle it Brexit and the figure of Britannia we used to see on the reverse of our pre-decimal pennies, running away from something very nasty. Anyway, getting back to salvation, the Roman Catholic Church then and now gives you three options. You can go to heaven, that's the destination for the very good. Hell for the very bad, obviously, or purgatory, that's for everyone else. And you go here to have your soul cleansed of sin for a period of time, and then you can go to heaven. Well, during the 13th century, it became increasingly popular to leave an endowment for priests to say mass on a regular basis, perhaps permanently if you've got enough money, for the benefit of your soul, to reduce the amount of time you were going to spend in purgatory. These endowments were known as chantries, from the old French chantiers, to sing. Now, many bridge chapels were set up as chantries, but only the wealthiest and generally urban bridge chapels possessed a full-time priest or chaplain. They're normally described as chaplain because they were non-parochial. For instance, Rochester Bridge, you've just seen, was set up really as a chantry chapel, and we know it was generally staffed by 3 priests. In other words, that attracted quite a lot of endowments. Now, earlier bridge chapels like London Bridge also attracted chantry endowments, because basically it paid for everything. It paid the fees for your priests, their assistants, the candles, and all your running costs. And as I've mentioned, a lot of chapels that couldn't afford a priest were cared for by hermits, and quite a lot of chapels we know only employed priests on a part-time basis to hold services. Now, it was this concept of salvation that really did for the English bridge chapels, and I'll explain why. On the left, you can see St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. It was built between 1506 and 1626. They had funding problems, they had wars, and you can see on the right Martin Luther. Now, there are numerous examples of indulgences. As I explained, there were, it was a get out of purgatory quick arrangement, being granted by bishops, archbishops, and even popes for bridge construction or repair. One for Scotland states that this is a really good thing to do because people have drowned while fording this river. So you're going to be saving lives and giving to God. And a study of 297 examples of indulgences granted within the Diocese of Exeter, that's Devon and Cornwall, between 1100 and 1536, revealed that the most popular category was public works, including bridges. That's 24% of the examples. The next most popular option were chapels, 22%, then parish churches at 18%. Hospitals, caring for the sick and the destitute, only come in next at 16%. Now, getting back to St. Peter's, in 1515, an international papal indulgence was issued to raise money to pay for the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica. And it was this blatantly commercial and corrupt sale of indulgences on a huge scale that prompted Martin Luther, you can see on the right, a German friar and theologian, in 1517 to produce his list of doctrinal points for discussion known as the 95 Theses, an act that started the Protestant Reformation. And it was basically the Reformation in England that really starts with Henry VIII breaking away from the Roman Catholic Church, then the suppression of the monasteries. But I want to stress that it's only really during his son Edward VI's short reign between 1547 and 1553 that we actually really go over to the Protestant faith. And as part of this, chantries were abolished and all their premises and endowments confiscated by a cash-strapped government. Now, a few chapels, such as Maidenhead you've just seen, survived because they were chapels of ease and people still wanted to worship there. But almost all the other bridge chapels closed. Some acquired secular functions, such as prisons, and as I explained, Morpeth acquired a range of functions. And then you get the 18th and 19th century economic expansion. The rebuilding of single lane bridges demolishes even more chapels, including those on bridge approaches. So in other words, we're now looking at only a tiny proportion of this class of monuments. So I want to briefly give you some figures. Since 2015, I've been involved in the compilation of a series of gazetteers of medieval bridge chapels and related monuments. Related monuments including beacon chapels, bridge crosses, bridge hermitages, and hospitals that fulfilled the role as bridge chapels, plus lighthouse chapels, ferry and river crossing chapels. Incidentally, some ford chapels become bridge chapels when they then build a bridge. And we've been looking at the whole of the UK and Ireland, and you can see the site numbers. Basically, England has got by far the largest number. This does include 8 lighthouse stroke beacon chapels and 5 ford or ferry chapels. And the other countries are the same. But it is interesting that England has by far the largest number. It's got 79%. I just want to briefly consider the reasons for this. It's probably to do with the density of population and widespread urban development. So you've got a comprehensive road network which involved building a lot of bridges. Ireland has a lot of major rivers, and in Ireland and Wales, bridge building seems to be linked with English conquest and castles construction. Many Irish bridges are fortified. So there's a different pattern of building. And in Scotland, the majority of bridge chapel sites are actually in the Edinburgh area that was the most urbanized. You're probably wondering, well, what do these figures mean in terms of the overall numbers? Well, the short answer to that is I can't give you reliable figures. We know there's over 500 pre-16th century bridges surviving structurally in some form across the UK. Now, they're often partial due to rebuilding. So I would guess, and this is a wild guess, there were over 3,000 medieval bridges of various sizes in the UK. So this means actually only a minority of bridges possessed a chapel or a cross. But a lot of the bridges that did were larger urban examples. And I think this is because the cost of building a bridge across a major river like the Trent, the Thames, or the Tyne was pretty expensive, and a chapel would have served as a place to collect alms, which would have contributed towards maintenance. And you can see below Whitby in North Yorkshire, there's the 1908 swing bridge. It's built on a site of a medieval bridge, first documented in 1351. On the right, you've got its bridge chapel, which is actually off to the left of the photograph of the bridge. This was rebuilt in 1777 to 8 and is dedicated to St. Ninian. He's a Scottish saint, but he's often known as St. Trinian in England. So there you go. St. Trinian's is more than just a girls' school. And here we've got two more bits of bridge, and this is a reminder that in countries where there was no Reformation, the practice of bridge chapels and shrines carry on. On the left, you can see the Charles Bridge in Prague, and this bridge during the 17th and 18th century was decorated with numerous statues of saints and shrines, including St. John of Neomok, who was tied to a wheel and drowned in the river Voltava in 1393 on the orders of the local king that had a massive quarrel. In England, there's still a few reminders of vanished bridge chapels. If you visit Holy Trinity Parish Church in Dartford, there's this lovely little window, the Hermit of the Ford, recalling the medieval hermits who run the local ford and bridge chapel here. And just to finish, got this lovely example in the city of Murcia in Spain. You can see on the left hand side of this building, on the southwest corner of the old bridge, is this very imposing neoclassical shrine. In the center of it, you can see there's a statue of the Blessed Virgin Mary holding the infant Christ. It was apparently built in 1839 and rebuilt. I think the whole thing was rebuilt when the associated building was constructed in 1893. But when I visited it a few years ago, on the little shelf in front of the shrine were still cut and potted flowers, showing it's still venerated. Well, that's all I've got. If you want to go back to
Yeah,
sort out some questions.
yeah. Thanks